We've all seen the movies. Dusty cowboys riding into lawless towns where the only rule is survival and the fastest gun wins. But here's the truth that Hollywood won't tell you. The Wild West had more laws than a modern homeowners association, and they were infinitely stranger. From regulations that weaponized fashion to ordinances that turned basic human functions into crimes, the frontier was governed by a legal code so bizarre it makes today's weirdest laws look perfectly sane. We're about to journey through 50 of the most unbelievable, head-scratching, and downright insane laws ever enforced on American soil. Buckle up, because the real Wild West was far weirder than fiction ever dared to be. 1. In the gold rush town of Aurora, Nevada, there was a law that perfectly captured the paranoid capitalism of the era. It was illegal to refuse to accept gold dust as payment for any transaction. This sounds almost reasonable until you understand the scam it enabled. Gold dust could be mixed with brass filings, sand, or literally any golden-colored powder. The law didn't require the gold to be pure, just that you had to accept it. Store owners became amateur metallurgists out of pure survival, keeping scales, acids, and magnets behind every counter. This wasn't consumer protection. It was legally mandated gambling. Every purchase was a game of, is this real gold or elaborate glitter? 2. Picture yourself in Boise, Idaho in 1872. You're walking down the street, minding your own business, when you sneeze. Congratulations, you just committed a misdemeanor. A real city ordinance made it illegal to sneeze loudly in public without covering your face. But this wasn't an early public health initiative. The law was passed because uncouth sneezing was considered as offensive as public cursing, a sign you were raised in a barn rather than a proper home. It was the Victorian era's attempt to legislate good breeding, transforming an involuntary bodily function into a class marker. In Boise, your allergies could literally get you arrested. 3. In Montana Territory, there existed a law so cynical it's almost impressive. It was illegal for a woman to open another person's mail, but perfectly legal for a man to do the exact same thing. Let me be clear. This wasn't about mail theft generally. Both men and women could be prosecuted for stealing mail, but the specific act of opening someone else's letter carried gender-specific penalties. The reasoning was breathtakingly sexist. Lawmakers believed women were naturally more gossipy and untrustworthy with secrets, while men would only open mail for legitimate business reasons. It was a legal system that literally wrote, "We trust you less," into the law books, based solely on your gender. 4. We think of wanted posters as the iconic symbol of frontier justice. But in Yuma, Arizona Territory, there was a law about them that reveals the weird economics of bounty hunting. It was illegal for any private citizen to create and distribute their own wanted poster offering a reward. Only official law enforcement or the actual victim of a crime could do that. Why? Because freelance bounty poster creators were running a brilliant scam. They'd print posters for non-existent crimes or wildly exaggerate minor offenses, collect tips from vigilantes, then disappear before anyone could collect a reward that never existed. It was the Old West's version of a GoFundMe scam, and it got so bad they had to outlaw the entire concept of DIY justice advertising. 5. In the cattle town of Abilene, Kansas, there was a specific ordinance that targeted one of the most sacred cowboy traditions. It was illegal to fire your gun into the air in celebration. This is the famous shooting out the lights, or celebratory gunfire, that's in every Western movie, and it was absolutely forbidden. But here's the twist. The law wasn't about the noise or even the danger of falling bullets. It was about the cost of broken glass. Every time a drunk cowboy shot out a saloon lamp or a store window, the town had to replace it at municipal expense because tracking down which specific cowboy fired which specific bullet was impossible. This law wasn't about safety. It was about the city budget. Abilene literally banned fun because it couldn't afford the repair bills. 6. Imagine you're a widower in Sacramento, California in the 1850s. Your wife has passed away, and after a year of mourning, you decide to remarry. Perfectly normal, right? Wrong. A California state law mandated that a widower had to wait a full year before remarrying, while a widow had to wait 2 years. This wasn't about grief or respect. It was about property and pregnancy. The legal system needed to ensure that any child born to a widow was definitely her late husband's child for inheritance purposes. It was a law that treated women's bodies like legal evidence in a property dispute, where a man's estate was more important than a woman's right to move forward with her life. 7. In the rough mining camp of Deadwood, South Dakota, before it became a proper town, there was an unwritten law enforced more strictly than any statute: the law of the claim jump. If you abandoned your mining claim for more than 48 hours without posting a notice, any other prospector could legally take it over. But here's where it gets dark. Abandonment was subject to interpretation. If you went to town for supplies and got delayed by weather, you could return to find your claim seized and your months of work erased. This led to miners working themselves to literal death, too terrified to take a break. It wasn't a law. It was a productivity cult that killed more men than cave-ins ever did. 8. Let's talk about Helena, Montana, and a law that perfectly illustrates how the West legislated morality. It was illegal for a woman to dance with a man unless there was at least 3 inches of space between them at all times. Dance hall monitors, usually older women hired by the city, would patrol with literal rulers, measuring the gap between dancing couples. If you were too close, both parties would be fined. This wasn't about morality in the abstract. It was about economics. Respectable dance halls wanted to distinguish themselves from brothels and gambling houses, so they turned dancing into a geometry problem. The most intimate thing you could legally do in Helena was maintain precise spatial awareness. 9. In Wyoming Territory, there was a law about homesteading. That sounds fair until you dig deeper. To claim 160 acres of public land, you had to build a dwelling that was at least 12 feet by 14 feet and live in it for 5 years. Sounds reasonable, but here's the loophole that became legendary. The law didn't specify 12 feet by 14 feet in which dimension. Crafty homesteaders built structures that were 12 inches by 14 inches, technically meeting the letter of the law. They'd place these dollhouse-sized cabins on the land, swear they'd lived in them, and claim the property. The government eventually caught on and closed the loophole, but not before thousands of acres were claimed by people who technically lived in what amounted to a large shoebox. 10. In the Arizona Territory, there was a specific law about water that reveals the brutal calculus of desert survival. If a traveler came to your property and requested water, you were legally required to provide it, even if you were enemies, even if they couldn't pay. Refusing water to a thirsty traveler was a criminal offense that could result in serious fines. This sounds humanitarian, and it partly was, but the real reason was pragmatic self-interest. Every rancher knew that someday they might be the one desperately needing water on someone else's land. It was the Old West's version of mutually assured survival. You helped others not because you were good, but because the desert would eventually put you in their position. 11. Picture Virginia City, Nevada, at the height of the silver boom. The town passed an ordinance making it illegal to wear a mask in public, unless you had a medical reason. This wasn't an early pandemic response. It was an anti-bandit measure, right? Wrong. It was actually designed to stop a very specific group: women wearing heavy veils. Respectable Victorian women often wore thick veils when traveling, but prostitutes had started using the same veils to move through respectable parts of town without being recognized. The law was a surgical strike to ensure that fallen women could always be identified and kept in their designated district. It was facial recognition technology, 19th century style. 12. In Leadville, Colorado, at an altitude of over 10,000 feet, there was a law perfectly tailored to its environment. It was illegal to deny anyone entrance to your home if they were suffering from altitude sickness. This sounds compassionate, but it wasn't about kindness. It was about legal liability. So many newcomers to the mining town were dying from altitude sickness that their families were suing property owners for failing to render aid. The town decided that if they legally required everyone to help, they could distribute the liability. Your home wasn't your castle in Leadville. It was a mandatory emergency room, whether you liked it or not. 13. Let's travel to Tucson, Arizona Territory, where they had a law about language that reveals the West's weird cultural paranoia. It was illegal to speak Spanish in a public school building, even outside of school hours, even if school wasn't in session. This wasn't just an educational policy. This was linguistic warfare. Arizona was purchased from Mexico just decades earlier, and the white establishment was terrified that Mexican culture would persist. So they criminalized a language in a building, as if architecture itself could enforce assimilation. You could speak Spanish everywhere else in town, but the moment you stepped into a school building, that specific structure transformed your native language into a crime. 14. In the wild port city of San Francisco, there was a law that perfectly captured the city's contradictory soul. It was illegal to keep more than 50 pounds of gunpowder in your home or business. Okay, that's reasonable fire safety. But here's the absurd part. There was no limit on how much gunpowder you could transport through the streets. You could walk down Market Street with a wagon carrying 5,000 pounds of explosives, and that was perfectly legal. But the moment you tried to store 51 pounds in your basement, you were a criminal. It was a law that was more afraid of static risk than dynamic catastrophe, like banning swimming pools but allowing tightrope walking over lava. 15. In Cheyenne, Wyoming, there was an ordinance about photography that sounds insane until you understand the technology. It was illegal to take someone's photograph without their explicit written consent. But this wasn't an early privacy law born of modern sensibilities. It was about superstition and control. Many Native Americans and Chinese immigrants believed that photographs could steal part of your soul. Additionally, photographs were being used as evidence in court, and people were terrified of being documented without their knowledge. The law transformed every photographer into a legal liability, requiring them to carry around stacks of consent forms. It was the Old West's version of GDPR, powered by mysticism and legal paranoia. 16. Here's one that sounds too stupid to be true, but it absolutely was. In Longmont, Colorado, it was illegal for a cat to run loose in the streets without a bell attached to its collar. Dogs, they could roam free. But cats, those silent predators, needed to be acoustically tagged. The reasoning was actually pragmatic in a twisted way. Cats were decimating the local bird population, which was reducing the number of insects being eaten, which was leading to crop damage. The town decided that if cats had bells, birds could hear them coming. It was an early attempt at ecosystem management that turned every cat owner into a legal cat beller. Imagine being the sheriff tasked with enforcing that. 17. In the Texas town of Amarillo, there was a law about sleep that reveals the harsh economics of frontier hospitality. It was illegal to sleep on someone else's property without permission, even in an emergency. This sounds like basic trespassing law, but it specifically targeted exhausted cowboys and travelers. If you were caught sleeping under someone's tree or in their barn without asking first, you could be arrested and fined. But here's the cynical twist. Property owners would often discover sleeping travelers, arrest them, then offer to pay their fine in exchange for a week of unpaid labor. It was a legal system that turned exhaustion into indentured servitude. The punishment for being too tired to ask permission was becoming temporary property yourself. 18. Let's talk about Santa Fe, New Mexico, and a law that perfectly illustrates the West's bizarre approach to public health. It was illegal to empty a chamber pot out of a second-story window between the hours of 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Notice what that law doesn't say. It doesn't ban the practice. It just restricts the hours. After 10 p.m., feel free to rain sewage down on the street below. This wasn't about sanitation. It was about not hitting people during business hours. It was a law that said, we accept that you're going to throw human waste into the street. We just ask that you do it when fewer people are walking around. It was the municipal version of, not my problem if you're out that late. 19. In the farming community of Walla Walla, Washington Territory, there was a specific law about wheat that reveals the dark side of agricultural economics. If you harvested your wheat and discovered it was infested with weevils or other pests, it was illegal to sell it, give it away, or even burn it on your own property. You were required to transport it at least 5 miles outside of town and bury it. This sounds like a quarantine procedure, and partly it was. But here's the cruel part. You still had to pay property tax on that wheat as if you'd sold it at market price. The law assumed you were lying about the infestation to avoid taxes. It was a system where a natural disaster became a taxable event. The government's cut was so sacred that even crop failure couldn't excuse you from payment. 20. In the wild and violent town of Tombstone, Arizona, we all know about the gun check law that led to the OK Corral. But there was another weapon law that's even stranger. It was illegal to carry a concealed slingshot within city limits. Not a gun, not a knife, a slingshot. Why? Because young men had turned slingshots into a guerrilla warfare tool. They'd load them with rocks, broken glass, or even small bags of flour or paint, and ambush rivals or businesses they didn't like. The damage from a well-aimed slingshot to a store's inventory or a rival's face was significant. This law existed because David's biblical weapon had become the Wild West's tool for petty violence. Tombstone literally had a bigger problem with slingshots than it knew what to do with. 21. In Silver City, New Mexico, there was a law about noise that seems reasonable until you see how it was enforced. It was illegal to make loud noises after 9 p.m. that could disturb the peace. Standard noise ordinance, right? But loud noises was defined to include a blacksmith working his forge, a baker preparing bread for the morning, or even a woman singing in her own home. Meanwhile, saloons could operate at full volume until 2 a.m. because they paid special licensing fees. It wasn't a noise law. It was a business regulation disguised as a quality of life ordinance. If you paid the city enough, you could make all the noise you wanted. If you were just trying to earn a living or exist in your own home, silence was mandatory. It was pay-to-play public disruption. 22. Let's go to Portland, Oregon, where they had a law about sidewalks that reveals the city's early obsession with image. Property owners were legally required to sweep the sidewalk in front of their building every single morning before 8 a.m. Miss a day? You'd be fined $5, which was about a day's wages for a laborer. But here's the absurd enforcement. The city hired sidewalk inspectors, whose entire job was to walk the streets at 8:01 a.m., looking for unswept sections. They carried measuring tools to document even a small pile of dust. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about creating jobs for political cronies and extracting fines from small businesses. It was municipal governance as a protection racket with brooms. 23. In the cattle drives passing through Kansas, there was a state law that sounds protective, but was actually economically devastating. It was illegal to transport Texas cattle through Kansas during summer months because of tick fever. This sounds like reasonable disease control. But here's the reality. Summer was the only time cattle drives were practical. The law effectively created a complete embargo on Texas beef, allowing Kansas ranchers to dominate the market without competition. Texas cattlemen had to take months-long detours through other territories, adding massive costs and cattle death. It wasn't public health. It was protectionism dressed up in medical language. It was the 1870s version of tariffs, enforced at the state level with scientific-sounding justification. 24. In the bizarre world of Carson City, Nevada, there was a law about insults that turned language into a legal minefield. It was illegal to accuse someone of being a liar in public. not threatening them, not physically assaulting them, just calling them a liar. The fine was $25, but here's where it gets interesting. You could call someone a thief, a coward, a cheat, or even question their parentage. But liar specifically was forbidden. Why? Because in a society built on credit and reputation, being called a liar was economic death. It meant no one would do business with you. The law recognized that liar was the one insult that could financially destroy someone, so they regulated it like a weapon. Every other insult was fair game, but that one word could get you arrested. 25. Picture Flagstaff, Arizona, a town that desperately wanted to be civilized. They passed a law requiring all businesses to install window curtains or shades. This sounds like a privacy measure or perhaps decency law. Not quite. The law was passed because the town's economy depended on convincing potential settlers that Flagstaff was a prosperous, established community. Buildings with windows, but no curtains, looked poor and temporary. So they legally mandated the appearance of prosperity. You could be operating a failing business, drowning in debt, but you better have curtains in your windows, or you'd face fines. It was compulsory theater, a law that required everyone to participate in the shared delusion that the town was thriving. 26. In the coal mining towns of Wyoming, there was a law about bathing that reveals the grim economics of company towns. Mining companies were required by territorial law to provide bathing facilities for workers. Sounds progressive, right? Here's the catch. They could charge for it. And they did. A bath cost 25 cents, which was roughly an hour's wages. The law required them to offer baths, but not to make them affordable. So miners were presented with a choice: spend an hour's pay to get clean, or stay covered in coal dust and face the health consequences. The law lets the mining companies advertise, "We provide baths," while knowing most miners couldn't afford them. It was a legal requirement without functional access, a specialty of frontier capitalism. 27. In Dallas, Texas, there was an ordinance about horses that sounds protective until you understand the property law beneath it. If a horse was found wandering the streets without an owner, it would be impounded and sold at auction after 30 days. Standard stray animal procedure. But here's the scam. The city wouldn't actually try very hard to find the owner. They'd post a single notice in one newspaper for one day. If you didn't happen to read that specific paper on that specific day, your horse was sold, and you got nothing. The sheriff's office and city officials had first right of refusal at the auction, and they'd buy valuable horses for pennies, then resell them. It was legal horse theft, with a 30-day waiting period. 28. Let's talk about Sacramento, and a law that weaponized time itself. It was illegal to be visibly intoxicated in public after 6 p.m. Before 6 p.m., you could be falling down drunk and the law didn't care. This wasn't about morality or public safety. It was about business zones. Before 6 p.m., drunk people were usually in the saloon district where their business was welcome. After 6 p.m., they'd wander into residential areas and shopping districts. The law created a temporal border. Your drunkenness wasn't illegal. Its location after a certain hour was. It was a zoning law enforced through the clock. A geographical restriction with a timestamp. 29. In the frontier town of Spokane, Washington, there was a law about laundry that was blatantly racist in its enforcement. It was illegal to operate a laundry service in a wooden building within city limits. This sounds like a fire safety measure, except that white-owned laundries and wooden buildings were never prosecuted, while Chinese-owned laundries were raided constantly. The law was written to sound neutral, but enforced to destroy Chinese businesses, specifically. It was legal discrimination hiding behind fire codes. The law didn't say Chinese laundries are illegal, but it achieved the same result while maintaining plausible deniability. 30. In the territorial prison system of Arizona, there was a rule so cynical it takes your breath away. Prisoners who were sentenced to hard labor in the mines could have their sentences reduced by finding valuable ore. For every significant strike, you could shave time off your sentence. This sounds almost fair. like a reward for good work. But here's the reality. Prisoners were taking insane risks, going into the most dangerous shafts, working without safety equipment, and dying at catastrophic rates because they were desperate to get out. The prison wasn't offering opportunity. It was incentivizing men to risk death for freedom. It was a system that turned your survival instinct into a productivity tool. 31. In Albuquerque, New Mexico Territory, there was a law about shade that reveals the brutal value system of the desert. It was illegal to cut down a cottonwood tree within town limits without permission from the city council. But you could cut down any other tree without restriction. Why cottonwood specifically? Because they were the only trees that provided significant shade and grew relatively quickly in that climate. This wasn't environmental protection. It was resource hoarding. The city council controlled who got shade and who didn't. In a place where shade was the difference between bearable and deadly heat, the law turned trees into political currency.